Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back into the dimly lit corridors of royal palaces, where tapestries muffled sound, candles flickered nervously, and power was inherited the way illnesses often are. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lower the lights. Let your phone rest on the nightstand. This is not a story about triumph or glory. This is a story about what happened after the cheering stopped. Because when a king lost his head, sometimes quite literally, someone else was left standing there, still breathing, still inconveniently alive. And that someone was usually his wife. Royal history loves executions. It adores them. They are clean narrative endings, a villain punished, a traitor exposed, a reign concluded with a neat, metallic thud. But history is far less interested in what came next. What happened to the queen who woke up the next morning without a crown, without a husband, and without the courtesy of being dead herself? So tonight, we'll let the execution block fade into the background, and we'll focus instead on the women who were quietly ushered away once their political usefulness expired. Let's begin somewhere very familiar. A cold stone palace, a woman who had done everything she was told, and a kingdom that suddenly decided she was a problem. Royal marriages were rarely romantic, which you already know, but they were also rarely optional. Queens did not marry men. They married alliances, treaties, fragile promises written in ink and bloodlines. And when those bloodlines produced inconvenient politics, or no male heirs, or the wrong religion, or simply the wrong personality, the woman attached to them became negotiable. Execution was the loud part. What followed was the quiet erasure. After a king was executed, his wife entered a peculiar limbo. She was too important to kill without consequences and too dangerous to keep visible. So monarchies developed a variety of soft endings for royal women. Convents were popular, not because anyone suddenly cared about their spiritual growth, but because convents were polite prisons with excellent public relations. A queen sent to a convent was technically alive, technically respected, and completely removed from power. She would be given a modest household, a few attendants, a schedule built around prayer, reflection, and never bothering anyone ever again. And the convent doors closed very gently behind her. Sometimes the transition was abrupt. One day she was attended by dozens. The next, she was allowed 2 dresses and a prayer book, and no one called her Your Majesty anymore. Other times, exile was the preferred solution. A queen might be shipped back to her homeland, assuming that homeland still wanted her, which it often didn't. Because an executed king was a diplomatic embarrassment, his widow was evidence that a political experiment had failed catastrophically. So she arrived home older, poorer, and politically radioactive, a living reminder of a marriage that had gone terribly wrong. And then there were the house arrests. These were especially popular with monarchies that wanted to keep an eye on things. A castle, yes, but the boring kind. Cold, remote, with very little to do except age. House arrest had the advantage of being quiet, no public sympathy, no dramatic martyrdom, just decades of enforced invisibility. And for royal women, invisibility was a kind of slow punishment. Let's pause here for a moment, because it's important to understand just how powerless these women were, even before their husbands died. A queen's authority almost always flowed through her husband. Her wealth was technically his. Her titles existed at his pleasure. Her children, even, were often considered assets of the crown rather than her own. So when he was executed, her entire identity collapsed at once. She was no longer queen, no longer wife, no longer politically protected. she became something far more dangerous in royal terms, a symbol, and symbols are either controlled or removed. Some widowed queens were forced into remarriage, which was less romantic than it sounds, which is saying something. A remarriage allowed the state to redirect her claim, her dowry, and her remaining political value into a new arrangement, often with a man who had little interest in her beyond her former status. And sometimes the new husband was chosen precisely because he was weak, elderly, or easily managed. Because of course he was. Other queens found themselves in endless legal limbo, arguing for their dowries, petitioning for pensions, writing letters that were politely ignored for years. Royal paperwork can be a very effective weapon. Now and then, a queen resisted. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, just stubbornly. She refused to disappear. She insisted on using her title. She wore black in public. She attended court events she technically was not invited to. And these women were often described by contemporaries as difficult, which in historical language usually means uncooperative with her own erasure. But resistance was exhausting, and most queens eventually learned that survival required compliance. The emotional toll of this quiet aftermath is harder to trace. Sources are thin, letters are filtered through politics, memoirs are rare. But occasionally we get glimpses. A former queen complaining about the cold, about loneliness, about how her children were taken from her, because children were often removed, especially sons. A boy with a claim was dangerous. A mother with influence over him was worse. So sons were sent to other courts, placed under guardianship, re-educated, sometimes never seen again. And the mother was told this was for their own good. Naturally. Daughters fared slightly better, in the sense that they were less likely to be executed later. They were often married off quickly, before their mother's political contamination could spread. And the mother watched from a distance, powerless to intervene. One of the cruelest aspects of this system was how normalized it all was. There were procedures, precedents, guidelines. Royal advisors knew exactly how to neutralize a widow, strip her income, limit her correspondence, control her movement, frame it as mercy, and everyone slept better afterward. Some royal women lived for decades after their husbands' executions, long enough to be forgotten by the public entirely. Their aged out of relevance, their portraits were moved into storage, their names faded into footnotes. Which, in a way, was the point, because royal women were never meant to outlive their political purpose. They were bridges between dynasties. Once the bridge collapsed, the remains were inconvenient. Let's drift gently over to another recurring theme: religion. Religion was both a weapon and an excuse. A queen could be blamed for her husband's downfall by association with the wrong faith, or praised for her quiet piety once she was safely removed. Conversion was sometimes demanded, public repentance encouraged, private belief irrelevant, because belief, like everything else, was political. Some queens leaned into religion as a survival strategy. They became conspicuously devout, excessively humble, very unthreatening, and this worked to an extent. A visibly pious queen was easier to tolerate. She could be framed as tragic rather than dangerous, a cautionary tale instead of a rallying point. Others were less fortunate. A queen who remained outspoken, who defended her husband's memory, who refused to accept blame. These women often found their confinements tightened, their allowances reduced, their visitors restricted. Not officially punished, just gradually suffocated by policy. Because overt cruelty would have been bad optics. Royal governments have always cared deeply about optics. It's worth noting how gendered this all was. Executed kings were remembered as tyrants, martyrs, or fools. Executed queens were remembered as scandals. Widowed kings remarried.
Widowed queens were expected to disappear. A widowed king was a ruler. A widowed queen was a liability. And if you're sensing a pattern here, yes, it was designed that way. Even sympathy had limits. Public mourning for a queen whose husband had been executed was carefully controlled. Too much grief suggested loyalty to the wrong cause. Too little made the regime look heartless. So grief was rationed. Official mourning periods, approved clothing, approved silence. After that, the widow was expected to move on, quietly. One last detail before we let this part fade out. Some royal women internalized all of this. They blamed themselves for the marriage, for the politics, for the execution, and they wrote letters filled with guilt, self-reproach, and regret. Letters that
Let's slip back in quietly. Nothing new has happened overnight. That was the point. For many royal women, the days after their husband's execution did not arrive with drama. They arrived with paperwork and silence. The court did not rush to decide their fate. Indecision was safer. Indecision allowed everyone to pretend that the problem might solve itself. A former queen would wake up and realize that no one had given her instructions, no schedule, no announcement, just nothing. And nothing can stretch for years. Her household was usually the first thing to shrink. Servants quietly reassigned, guards reduced, ladies-in-waiting encouraged to seek other opportunities, which was a polite way of saying, this woman is no longer useful to be seen beside. Rooms were closed. Entire wings of palaces went unused. Fireplaces stopped being lit. And gradually, the physical space around her began to match her political space. Smaller, colder, easier to ignore. Money, of course, became a constant problem. Queens were often promised pensions after their husbands' deaths, generous ones on paper, but paper was flexible. Payments arrived late, or not at all. Excuses piled up, budgets were reassessed, and a woman who had once commanded treasuries now found herself counting coins. This wasn't accidental. Financial dependence was another form of containment. A queen without money could not travel, could not gather supporters, could not be generous. Generosity creates loyalty, and loyalty in the wrong hands becomes dangerous. So allowances were trimmed, then trimmed again. Naturally, this was framed as necessity. The kingdom was struggling. Sacrifices had to be made. Strangely, these sacrifices always seemed to involve women who no longer had husbands. Public appearances became rare, sometimes forbidden outright. A widow whose husband had been executed was a walking reminder of instability, of bloodshed, of political failure. Seeing her unsettled people. So she stayed indoors. And when she did appear, she was watched carefully. Every gesture noted, every word weighed. Grief itself became regulated. Too much sorrow suggested loyalty to the executed king. Too little suggested coldness and guilt. So queens learned to grieve just enough, quietly, tastefully, on schedule. Black clothing became a uniform, widowhood a permanent identity, and unlike men, royal women were rarely allowed to outgrow it. Even years later, remarriage could be denied because a new marriage meant new alliances, new risks. Better to leave her suspended in time. Some queens turned inward. They read, they prayed, they embroidered endlessly. Embroidery appears constantly in records for a reason. It was acceptable, harmless, unambitious. A woman who embroidered was not plotting. Others focused obsessively on routine.
Meals at exact times, walks measured to the minute. Routine was control, and control was survival. Children, if any remained nearby, were often the only anchor. But even motherhood was closely supervised. A queen whose husband had been executed was not trusted to raise future rulers. She might tell the wrong stories, teach the wrong loyalties. So tutors intervened, advisors hovered, access was limited. She became a visitor in her own children's lives. And eventually, even that faded. As children grew older, they were pulled into public roles, sent away, married off, absorbed by the state. The mother remained behind, always behind. Some women tried to preserve memory. They collected letters, portraits, small personal items belonging to their husbands. Quiet acts of defiance. But even memory could be dangerous. Possessing too many reminders of a disgraced king suggested unresolved allegiance. So these keepsakes were sometimes confiscated or lost. History edited itself in real time. Occasionally, a former queen would fall ill. Not dramatically, just slowly. Poor food, cold rooms, loneliness. Medical care was adequate, which is to say, minimal. A dead widow solved many problems. A live one created questions. So care was never rushed. When these women died, announcements were brief, funerals modest, attendance limited. No grand monuments, no heroic inscriptions. Just a name, a date, and a careful avoidance of context. And that was usually the end. But not always. A few royal widows lived long enough to see the world forget them entirely. New rulers rose, new scandals replaced old ones, and they became harmless through obscurity, which, ironically, was the safest position they could occupy. To be forgotten was to be free. As you lie there now, drifting further down, imagine the stillness of those later years. The same view from the same window, season after season. A life that once shaped politics reduced to quiet observation. No throne, no voice, no ending dramatic enough to be remembered. Just time passing. In the next part, we'll continue following these women even further into their afterlives, how some were rewritten as villains, others as saints, and most as footnotes. But for now, rest. The corridors are empty, the guards have stopped watching, and history, as always, has moved on without asking permission.
Let's drift back in again. Nothing sharp, nothing urgent, just the soft continuation of lives that history preferred to smooth over. By the time many of these royal women reached the later years of their lives, something subtle had happened. They were no longer considered threats, they were considered stories. And stories, unlike living people, are easy to control. Once a queen whose husband had been executed stopped asking for money, stopped writing letters, stopped appearing in public, she became safe enough to reinterpret. This is where historians, especially the official ones, stepped in, because a disgraced king left behind a problem, and that problem needed explaining. It was never enough to say the politics failed or the system was unstable. That would have been uncomfortable, so blame needed a shape, and that shape was often feminine. A former queen might quietly transform on parchment into something far more dramatic than she ever was in life. If she had been quiet and withdrawn, she became cold. If she had been stubborn, she became scheming. If she had mourned too visibly, she became fanatical. And if she had survived too long, she became suspicious. History dislikes ambiguity. It prefers characters. So royal widows were assigned roles. Some were rewritten as villains. Foreign women, especially, were convenient scapegoats.
She brought bad influence. She whispered into the king's ear. She weakened him. She distracted him. Naturally, this was said even when the king had been perfectly capable of ruining things on his own. Other women were recast as tragic saints. These were the widows who stayed silent, who prayed, who accepted their confinement politely. Their obedience became virtue. Their suffering became proof of innocence. They were praised not for what they did, but for what they didn't do. They didn't protest. They didn't rebel. They didn't survive loudly. And then there were the majority, the ones who were neither dramatic villains nor saintly martyrs. These women simply faded. Their names appeared less frequently. Their letters stopped being copied. Their stories were summarized into a sentence or two. Widow of the late king. Lived quietly thereafter. Died in obscurity. Which is a tidy way of saying no one cared enough to record the details, and so history became quiet again. But even in that quiet, patterns remain. One of the most consistent was how quickly responsibility was reassigned. A king's execution was framed as inevitable, necessary, justified, and the queen's suffering afterward was framed as collateral. Unfortunate, yes, but unavoidable. This allowed future rulers to sleep at night, because acknowledging her humanity too clearly would have meant acknowledging cruelty. And monarchies were very good at avoiding that. It's worth noticing how rarely these women were allowed complexity. They were not permitted to be intelligent and loyal, or grieving and politically aware. They were flattened into lessons, warnings for future queens, cautionary examples: marry wisely, obey carefully, disappear gracefully. Royal daughters were often raised on these stories, quietly reminded of what happened to women who outlived their usefulness, and they learned. They learned how to speak less, smile more, align themselves carefully. Survival became a skill passed down through silence. Now and then, a former queen tried to intervene in her own legacy. She funded religious foundations, commissioned charitable works, endowed schools or hospitals, not purely out of devotion, but visibility. A charitable widow was harder to dismiss entirely. These acts created records, and records, however small, could outlive slander. But even charity had limits. Too much generosity suggested ambition. Too much public presence risked reopening old wounds. So even goodness had to be restrained. What's striking is how rarely anyone asked these women what they thought. Not contemporaries, not later historians. Their internal lives were considered irrelevant, which is ironic given how obsessively royal women were watched while alive. Once quiet, they became blank, and blanks are easy to write over. Some former queens were later rediscovered centuries afterward, pulled back into narratives by curious scholars. But even then, they were often treated as curiosities rather than people. She endured much suffering. She was treated unfairly, which is true and also incomplete, because suffering without context becomes aesthetic, tragic but distant, and distance makes it easier to forget responsibility. Let's pause here for a moment. Picture one of these women late in life, her hair gray, her hands slower. The court that once buzzed around her long since moved on. New scandals, new executions, new widows. She has outlived relevance, which paradoxically gives her a kind of peace. No one watches her closely anymore. No one edits her words. She can think freely now. But thinking freely after decades of constraint is a strange skill. Some women filled their final years with intense devotion, others with reflection. A few became bitter. Most simply became quiet. And when they died, the world barely noticed. But the systems that shaped their lives remained intact. The lesson monarchies took from executed kings was not humility, it was caution. Don't fail publicly, don't lose control, and if you do, make sure the consequences fall elsewhere, usually on women. As you sink deeper into rest, Notice how gently all of this passes. No dramatic endings, no satisfying justice, just time smoothing over discomfort. That's how most royal cruelty survived so long, by being boring, administrative, routine, wrapped in velvet and ceremony. In the next part, we'll continue drifting forward into how future queens tried to learn from these quiet disappearances and how fear shaped royal marriages long after the execution blocks were cleared away. But for now, sleep. The chroniclers have closed their books, the widow's rooms are dark, and history, having taken what it needed, has gone quiet again.
Let's settle back in again. Nothing has changed suddenly. That, as always, is the theme. By the time the next generation of queens arrived at court, the execution blocks had been scrubbed clean. The blood was gone. The lessons, however, remained. Royal women were very good at remembering what happened to other royal women. They remembered the quiet disappearances, the controlled grief, the decades of polite confinement. No one had to explain it to them. The palace did that on its own. A new queen entering court did so with a mental map already forming. These corridors lead to power, those lead to isolation. She learned quickly which doors had once closed behind other women, and she adjusted. Queens became cautious to the point of invisibility. They spoke carefully. They laughed at the correct moments. They did not form friendships that could be mistaken for factions. They did not express strong opinions in public. A queen who had opinions was a risk. So they mastered neutrality. Marriage itself became a performance. Public affection was calculated. Too little suggested distance. Too much suggested manipulation. Private life was even more constrained. Arguments were suppressed. Disagreements softened, because a queen who openly challenged her husband risked being remembered as influential, and influence, in hindsight, was dangerous. If a king later failed, history would look for someone to blame. Queens were determined not to volunteer. Motherhood became strategic. Producing heirs was still the central expectation, but now there was an added layer. A queen needed heirs who were not just healthy, but uncontroversial. Children were carefully presented, their education monitored, their personalities shaped early. A child who seemed too independent was gently redirected. A child who showed too much affection for their mother was encouraged to bond with tutors instead. Distance, again, was safety. Even grief was managed with foresight. Queens observed how mourning had trapped their predecessors in black clothing and eternal suspicion. So some chose to mourn briefly, publicly, then move forward, which made them appear resilient, and resilience was safer than devotion. Others leaned into public charity immediately after loss. They shifted the narrative. Not grieving widow, devoted mother, pious benefactor. Rebranding was survival. Fear also shaped religion. Queens aligned themselves with whatever faith was safest politically, not necessarily spiritually. Conversion was embraced quickly when needed. Public piety displayed generously. Because a queen whose beliefs aligned with the state was less likely to be blamed for its collapse. Foreign queens learned this lesson most sharply. They arrived with accents, different customs, different foods, all potential liabilities. So they erased parts of themselves quickly, changed dress, changed speech patterns. They learned how to belong just enough not to stand out. Standing out was fatal. Behind all of this was the knowledge that queens were replaceable. A king could remarry, a dynasty could continue. A queen, however, could not recover from being labeled a problem. So queens learned to preempt the accusation. They became quieter, more agreeable, which is how royal courts gradually filled with women who appeared serene, composed, and strangely absent. not because they lacked depth, but because depth had proven dangerous. And yet, despite all this careful self-erasure, executions continued. Kings still failed, politics still collapsed, and when it happened, the old patterns re-emerged. Widows were contained, memories edited, lives shrunk. Fear had taught queens how to survive longer, not how to escape. Some tried. A few queens secretly maintained correspondence networks, trusted relatives, foreign allies, not to seize power, but to ensure options, escape routes, places to go if things went wrong. Others invested heavily in religious institutions early. They built their own refuges in advance. A convent was less terrifying if you had helped fund it, and a widow supported by clergy was slightly harder to mistreat openly. These were small protections, imperfect ones, but they mattered. What's striking is how much emotional labor went into all of this. Queens carried not just their own fear, but the accumulated memory of those before them. Every polite smile contained calculation, every silence strategy, and none of this was acknowledged. Official records praised obedience, grace, dignity. They did not mention vigilance. As you rest now, imagine the weight of that knowledge. Knowing that love could be reframed as manipulation, that grief could be weaponized, that survival itself might be suspicious, and still showing up every day, still smiling, still producing heirs for a system that had demonstrated repeatedly how easily it discarded women. That quiet endurance is easy to overlook because it leaves no monuments, but it shaped dynasties just as surely as wars did. In the next part, we'll continue drifting into the rare cases where royal widows stepped out of the script and what happened when they refused to disappear quietly. But for now, rest. The court has settled for the night, the queen's chambers are dark, and history, as always, is pretending this was all inevitable.
Let's drift back in again. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. Just the soft continuation of a pattern that mostly held, and then, occasionally, didn't. Most royal widows followed the script. They had learned what survival looked like. Small rooms, limited voices, carefully measured silence. But every so often, a woman reached the far end of that narrow path and decided not to keep walking. Not dramatically, not with banners or speeches, just with a refusal. These were the widows who did not disappear quickly enough, who lived too long, spoke too clearly, remembered too much, and history did not quite know what to do with them. Some former queens used time itself as a weapon. They waited. They outlived advisors who had pushed for their confinement. They outlived ministers who had signed the orders. They even outlived the children who had once been used to justify keeping them quiet. Longevity in a royal widow was deeply inconvenient, because the longer she lived, the more unstable the official story became. She remembered conversations that were supposed to be forgotten. She remembered promises that had never been honored, and occasionally, she reminded people. Not publicly, that would have been punished, but privately, in letters, in conversations that drifted just a little too close to honesty. Some widows became experts at presence. They attended events they technically had no reason to attend. They appeared at religious festivals, funerals, public ceremonies, always respectful, always calm, and always visible. Visibility alone was a statement. Others chose a quieter defiance. They built intellectual lives. They collected books, sponsored scholars, maintained correspondence with thinkers, clerics, and distant relatives. A thinking widow was not expected, and therefore unsettling. She could not rule, but she could observe, and observation is dangerous in systems built on selective memory. A few royal widows leaned heavily into maternal identity. They positioned themselves not as political actors, but as mothers of the realm. They advocated for their children relentlessly, not with passion, but persistence. Petitions, legal appeals, requests framed as concern, not ambition. This was exhausting work, but it occasionally paid off. A son restored to a title, a daughter granted a better marriage, a pension quietly increased. Small victories, earned slowly. And then there were the women who became symbols despite themselves. A widow who dressed simply, lived modestly, refused luxury. Over time, people began to talk. She suffered unfairly. She was wronged. Sympathy crept in, quietly, and sympathy is unpredictable. Authorities disliked it, but suppressing it risked drawing attention. So they tolerated it, carefully. In rare cases, a widow was allowed to return to court in some limited role. Not as queen, never that, but as an elder presence, a reminder of continuity. This was dangerous territory, because familiarity breeds questions, and questions breed reevaluation. Still, sometimes it happened. Usually decades later, when the original execution felt distant enough to be abstract. The most striking thing about these women was not rebellion, it was endurance. They did not overthrow systems, they did not rewrite laws. They simply refused to vanish on schedule. And that alone unsettled the machinery of monarchy. Of course, not all resistance ended well. Some widows pushed too far. They spoke too openly, defended their husbands too fiercely, criticized the regime that had spared them. Their confinement tightened, their correspondence restricted, their world shrank again. The system reminded them of its reach. But even then, something had shifted. Once a widow had acted, had spoken, had asserted memory, she could not be fully erased again. Someone had heard her, and that mattered. As you rest now, notice how quiet this resistance is. No marches, no proclamations, just persistence, just being there. In a world designed to forget you, being remembered is an act. By the time these women died, some were still officially ignored, but unofficially they lingered, in rumors, in private letters, in family memories passed down quietly. And those memories sometimes resurfaced generations later. Not enough to change outcomes, but enough to complicate narratives, which is often most any individual can do against an institution. In the next part, we'll drift toward the final stage of this long afterlife, what happened centuries later when historians, artists, and modern audiences looked back and tried to make sense of these women again. But for now, rest. The widow's candle has burned low, the court sleeps, and history, for once, is not entirely in control of the story. Let's drift back in. No rush, no sharp edges, just the slow continuation of lives that had already been simplified once and were about to be simplified again. By the time centuries passed, most of these royal widows were no longer remembered as people. They had become concepts, footnotes, cautionary examples, occasionally decorative tragedies. History, at a safe distance, grows bold. Once everyone involved was long dead, the king, the executioners, the ministers who signed the orders, it suddenly became acceptable to feel sympathy. carefully measured sympathy, nothing too disruptive. Historians began to look back and say things like, "She suffered greatly. She was treated harshly," which was true, and also strangely bloodless, because suffering, when viewed from far away, becomes tidy. Their confinement turned into retirement, their surveillance into protection, their isolation into withdrawal from public life. Language softened everything, and once the language softened, the system felt less cruel. Artists joined in. Paintings appeared, often imagined, long after the fact. Queens shone with downcast eyes, soft light, hands folded, always calm, always composed, rarely angry, never furious. Which is interesting, because fury would have been reasonable, but fury is uncomfortable. Calm sorrow is much easier to hang on a wall. Writers followed, plays, poems, later novels. These women were recast as tragic heroines. Wronged, yes, but passive. They endured. They waited. They died. The quietness remained. What disappeared was the bureaucracy, the endless petitions, the slow starvation of power. No one wrote scenes about waiting months for a letter that never came, or asking permission to travel 10 miles and being denied. Those details were boring. Cruelty is most effective when it's boring. Modern audiences often imagine that being spared execution was mercy, and technically it was, but mercy that lasts 40 years can become something else entirely. It becomes management. One of the strangest outcomes of all this retrospective sympathy is that it rarely changes conclusions. People feel bad, then they move on. The monarchy remains fascinating. The executions remain dramatic. The widows remain background. Even when they are centered gently, as atmosphere, as mood, not as agents. And that, in a way, completes the cycle. These women were managed in life. They were managed in memory. Their anger muted, their intelligence softened, their endurance aestheticized. It's comforting, because acknowledging how deliberately their lives were constrained would mean acknowledging how deliberately systems protect themselves, and systems prefer nostalgia. As you lie there now, almost fully adrift, imagine the final irony. These women survived scandal, survived loss, survived decades of controlled existence, only to be turned eventually into soothing stories. Stories told quietly, at a distance, often at bedtime. Which brings us here, a calm voice, low light, history repackaged as something gentle. And maybe that's not such a bad thing, because even softened, even filtered, these stories still carry something important. They remind us that survival is not always loud, that endurance doesn't always look heroic, and that being spared is not the same as being free. In the final part, we'll let this story settle completely, looking at what remains once the crowns, accusations, and labels finally fall away. But for now, rest. The palace has gone dark, the chroniclers have stopped writing, and the women history tried to silence are finally allowed to sleep.
Let's come back one last time. Slowly, no effort required. By the end of these stories, by the point where centuries have passed and the details have thinned, something curious happens. The crown, which once defined everything, stops mattering. Titles fade first. Queen, consort, dowager, they soften into descriptors rather than identities. What remains are simply women who lived inside a system that had very little room for them once it no longer needed them. When modern historians strip away the ceremony, a quieter picture emerges. These women were not passive by nature, they were trained into passivity. They were not fragile by design, they were constrained until fragility was the safest posture left. And they were not silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because silence extended their lives. What really happened to royal women after their husbands were executed is not a single outcome. It is a long gradient, from relevance to inconvenience, from inconvenience to containment, from containment to obscurity, and then eventually to abstraction. What's left behind are traces. A letter asking again for money promised years earlier, a household inventory listing fewer and fewer items, a burial record without ceremony, sometimes a line in the margin, sometimes nothing at all. And that absence is part of the story, because power does not only destroy loudly, it erodes quietly, one decision at a time, one restriction at a time, always justified, always reasonable. No one moment looks cruel enough to protest, but decades later, the life is gone. That is the legacy most of these women shared. They did not fall, they were worn down. And yet, this is important, they lived, they adapted. They endured systems designed to make endurance uncomfortable. They navigated grief that was monitored, motherhood that was restricted, and identities that were rewritten without their consent. That kind of survival rarely looks impressive in hindsight, but it is survival all the same. As listeners, as readers, we often want resolution, vindication, justice. History rarely offers that. What it offers instead is perspective. The reminder that being spared execution was not freedom, that mercy can be conditional, that silence can be enforced politely, and that sometimes the most honest ending is not a dramatic one. Just a woman growing older in a quiet place, watching seasons change, knowing that she outlived the moment meant to define her. As you rest now, fully settled, breathing slow, let that be enough. No crowns, no judgments, no lessons hammered too loudly, just the soft understanding that history is full of people who survived something terrible and then had to keep living afterward. Sleep easy. The palace is gone, the execution block is empty, and at last, nothing is being asked of them anymore.
Let's drift back in once more, very gently, as though nothing new is about to happen, because, for the most part, nothing ever did. After the crowns lost their meaning, after the records thinned and the names softened, life still went on. Not dramatically, not memorably, just steadily. For the royal women who outlived execution, scandal, and usefulness, existence became small in a way that history rarely documents. They woke up, they ate, they waited for letters that sometimes arrived and often didn't. Waiting became the central activity, waiting for permission, waiting for money, waiting for news of children who now lived elsewhere, waiting for relevance to return, even though they knew it wouldn't. And over time, waiting turned into habit. Some former queens became deeply familiar with the rhythms of places they never chose. They knew when the light reached certain windows, which rooms stayed cold no matter the season, which servants were kind, and which were simply doing their jobs. They learned how to exist without being seen. This wasn't resignation exactly, it was adjustment. Humans are very good at adjusting to constraint. Many of these women developed interior lives far richer than anything they had been allowed publicly. They thought, they remembered, they reassessed their pasts. Some came to defend their husbands privately, even if they never spoke it aloud. Others grew quietly angry. Anger that had nowhere to go eventually settles. It becomes reflection. And reflection, unchecked by power,
becomes clarity. Late in life, some widows understood their marriages differently. What had once seemed like destiny revealed itself as transaction. What had once felt like love looked more like expectation. This realization was not liberating, but it was honest. Religion often deepened during these years, not always out of belief, but out of structure. Prayer gave shape to time. Ritual gave days edges. Faith was something no council could revoke. Others turned to memory as their final territory of ownership. They replayed conversations, reimagined moments where choices might have shifted outcomes, not because it changed anything, because remembering was still theirs. Occasionally, a visitor arrived, a distant relative, a curious noble, someone young enough to ask questions, and for a brief moment, the widow became a storyteller. She spoke carefully, not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough to ensure that the official version was not the only one that survived. These conversations mattered more than they seemed, because history is often carried forward not by records, but by impressions. A quiet comment, a hesitation, a look that suggested the truth was more complicated. And complexity is contagious. Eventually, age settled in fully. Bodies slowed. Illness lingered longer. At this stage, even surveillance relaxed. No one was afraid of an old woman anymore, which is its own kind of insult and its own kind of relief. Death, when it came, was rarely traumatic. No poison, no intrigue, just exhaustion. And when they were buried, the world barely noticed. But here's the thing. A life does not need witnesses to have existed. These women lived entire decades after history decided their stories were over. Decades of thought, of feeling, of private meaning. And none of that disappears simply because it wasn't recorded. As you sink deeper now, let that idea linger softly. That survival doesn't end when the story does. That people keep living beyond the margins. That silence is not emptiness, it's just unobserved life. In the next part, we'll let this quiet stretch even further into how modern audiences, almost accidentally, began listening again. But for now, rest. The rooms are dim, the clocks are slow, and nothing is expected anymore.
Let's return softly, as if we're stepping into a room that's been quiet for a very long time. For centuries, these royal women existed in history the way old furniture exists in ancestral homes. Always there, rarely noticed, never questioned. Then, slowly, almost by accident, people began to look again. Not monarchs, not courts, readers, researchers, students leafing through archives with no loyalty to dynasties. And they noticed something strange. The records didn't add up. A queen mentioned constantly while her husband lived, and then barely at all after his execution. A pension promised repeatedly, and then quietly unpaid. Children removed without explanation. Moves recorded with no reason given. Silences where there should have been voices. At first, these gaps were treated as inconvenience, missing data, lost documents. But eventually, someone asked the uncomfortable question, why is she not here? And that question changed everything. Modern historians, less invested in protecting royal reputations, began to read absence as evidence. They stopped asking, what did she do wrong, and started asking, what was done to her? That shift was subtle, but powerful. It reframed widowhood not as passive retreat, but an enforced removal. It reframed obedience as survival.
It reframed silence as containment. Letters once dismissed as whining suddenly looked like documentation. Financial complaints became proof of systematic neglect. Routine requests, travel, housing, contact with children revealed a life managed down to the smallest detail. And slowly, the image softened again, but this time in a different direction. These women were no longer villains or saints. They were people navigating collapse. Writers followed this reevaluation. Historical novels began to give these widows interior lives, complexity, anger, sometimes too much anger, sometimes not enough. But at least they were speaking now, even if through fiction. Museums adjusted labels. Academic papers reframed conclusions. Not dramatically. Institutions rarely do anything dramatically, but quietly, which feels appropriate. Public interest followed. Audiences grew curious about what happened after the dramatic moment, after the headline. They wanted to know about the years that came next. And those years, it turns out, were full of meaning, even if not action. The most important change was this. People began to recognize endurance as a form of history. Not just events, not just decisions, but persistence, the act of continuing under constraint. That is harder to dramatize, but easier to relate to. As you rest now, almost fully drifting, notice how the story has come full circle. Once, these women were silenced to maintain order. Now, they are remembered to understand it. Not to glorify monarchy, not to condemn it entirely, but to see it clearly. And clarity, when delivered gently, can be restful. In the final part, we'll let this story settle completely, not with conclusions, but with quiet acknowledgement. But for now, sleep. The archive lights are dim. The pages rest open. And the voices, at last, are no longer ignored.
Let's ease in one final time. Nothing too new to learn now. Nothing left to prove. By the time we reach this point in the story, the urgency has dissolved. There are no arguments to win, no reputations to rescue, no verdicts to deliver. Just the quiet recognition that these lives happened. What really happened to royal women after their husbands were executed was not one thing, but many small things layered over time. A door that closed and stayed closed, a letter unanswered, a title no longer spoken aloud. None of it dramatic enough to interrupt daily life, all of it permanent. And perhaps that is why these stories fit so naturally into the edges of sleep. They are not about sudden endings, they are about continuation, about waking up the next day in a world that has already decided you no longer matter, and continuing anyway. If we strip away the palaces and crowns, what remains is deeply ordinary. Loss, uncertainty, adaptation. These women learned how to exist inside limits they did not choose. They learned how to be careful with words, with memory, with hope. They learned that survival often meant becoming smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. And still, within that shrinking space, they lived entire inner lives. Thoughts no one recorded, emotions no one approved. Those things mattered, even if history ignored them. It's tempting from a distance to wish for something louder, a rebellion, a revenge, but most human lives don't resolve that way. They settle, they endure, and there is a strange dignity in that endurance, even when it goes unnamed. As you lie there now, breathing slow, let the story loosen its grip. No more analysis,
No more narrative weight. Just the understanding that history is full of people who were spared the spectacle of death, and then asked to disappear quietly. Some did. Some didn't entirely. And now, centuries later, we remember them not as queens, not as symbols, but as people who kept going after the moment that was supposed to end them. That's enough for night. The lights are low. The palace is empty. The story is finished.